Here's what they don't tell you about Patton. The Army tried to stop it. Not because it was inaccurate, because it was too accurate. The greatest war film ever made was also the most resisted, most censored, and most politically dangerous project Hollywood had ever attempted. And it almost never made it to your screen. Secret won. Before it was celebrated, before it won awards, Patton was nearly buried. The opening speech was deemed too dangerous to film. The film begins with George C. Scott standing alone before a massive American flag, delivering a monologue so aggressive, so profane, and so unapologetically honest that studio executives panicked. They wanted it gone. The language was too harsh, the tone was too confrontational. Audiences would walk out, they warned. Director Franklin J. Schaffner refused to budge. Francis Ford Coppola, who co-wrote the script, defended the scene as essential. It wasn't just an introduction. It was a declaration. The speech was lifted from Patton's real words. Scott prepared with military intensity, refusing to rehearse until the final take. His delivery was so commanding that crew members later admitted they felt like soldiers being addressed by their general. The raw power of that scene shattered expectations. Critics who initially feared it later called it one of the boldest openings in cinema history. It introduced Patton not as a sanitized hero, but as a force of nature. Brilliant, terrifying, and uncontainable. The studio's fears were proven wrong. The opening became legendary. Patton announced exactly who he was, and the Army wasn't ready for that honesty. Secret 2. The U.S. Army refused to support the film for years. Long before cameras rolled, the Pentagon had already decided this story was too risky. George S. Patton wasn't just a decorated general. He was a public relations nightmare. Brilliant on the battlefield, reckless everywhere else. His temper was legendary. His views were explosive. His career nearly ended not from enemy fire, but from his own mouth. Military leaders feared that any film would either glorify his excesses or reopen wounds the Army had spent decades trying to bury. The slapping incidents, the political blunders, the controversies that made him effective in war, but dangerous in peace. For years, the Army withheld cooperation. No tanks, no uniforms, no locations. Without Pentagon support, the project seemed impossible. Producers were told the story was not in the national interest. Translation: Patton was too complicated, too contradictory, and too honest for comfort. The resistance wasn't just bureaucratic. It was institutional self-preservation. And the Army's refusal was only the beginning of the battle. What the filmmakers didn't know yet was that military resistance would be the least of their problems. An even more powerful force was preparing to shut them down completely. And this time, it was personal. Patton's own family was about to declare war on Hollywood. But first, the Army had to explain why they were so afraid. George S. Patton was a nightmare wrapped in success. On the battlefield, he was unstoppable. His Third Army liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, and moved faster than any force in American history. Tactically, he was a genius. Politically, he was a disaster. Patton believed in reincarnation. He claimed he'd fought as a Roman legionnaire and a Napoleonic cavalryman. He spoke openly about destiny, glory, and his love of war. Not his duty, but his personal fulfillment. His language was profane even by military standards. His views on diplomacy were non-existent. And then came the incidents that nearly ended everything. Sicily, 1943. 2 separate military hospitals, 2 terrified soldiers suffering from battle fatigue. Patton slapped them both, called them cowards, threatened to shoot one. The scandal erupted. Eisenhower nearly relieved him. The press demanded his removal. His career hung by a thread. Post-war America needed heroes, but clean ones. War film icons who inspired without complicating. Patton was too raw, too volatile, too honest about what war actually demanded. The Army had spent years managing his legacy, softening his edges, burying his controversies. A film would undo all of that control. If the Army's resistance was institutional, the Patton family's opposition was deeply personal and far more powerful. For over 20 years, they held the line. Patton's widow and children weren't just protective. They were gatekeepers. They controlled access to his letters, diaries, and personal records. Without their cooperation, no authentic portrayal was possible, and they had no intention of cooperating. Their fear was simple. Hollywood would reduce him to a caricature. The profane general, the slapping incident, the controversial quotes. They believed filmmakers would sensationalize his flaws while ignoring his brilliance, his strategic mind, his devotion to his soldiers, his complex understanding of warfare. They had already watched earlier attempts collapse under their objections. Multiple studios tried. Multiple scripts were written. Every time the family said no. They weren't being difficult. They were protecting someone they loved from becoming a punchline. The man they knew read poetry, studied history, and wept over fallen soldiers. That Patton would never make it to the screen. But there was a painful irony they couldn't escape. The longer they resisted, the more Patton was remembered only for his temper. The incidents overshadowed the legacy. Silence wasn't preserving his image. It was erasing everything else. It's extraordinarily rare for a family to successfully block a major biopic for decades. Yet, slowly, reluctantly, they began to soften. Not because Hollywood promised to sanitize the story, but because one producer finally convinced them that complexity could coexist with respect. The full truth, told honestly, might be the only way to save his legacy. If you're still watching, you're already part of the small group who cares about these untold stories. Most people scroll past history this honest, but you didn't. That tells me something. If this channel is delivering the kind of deep dives you can't find anywhere else, subscribe. Because stories like this take time to uncover, and I can only keep doing this if you show YouTube you want more. Hit that button. Let's make sure these truths don't get buried again. When a young Francis Ford Coppola approached the Patton script, he made a decision that nearly killed the entire project. He refused to write a war movie. Studios expected spectacle, tank battles, explosions, heroic charges. What Coppola delivered was a psychological dissection. He wasn't interested in what Patton did. He wanted to explore why. The obsessions that drove him, the contradictions that defined him, the beliefs that made him both brilliant and dangerous. The script terrified executives. It opened with Patton claiming he'd lived past lives as a warrior, Roman legions, medieval battlefields, Napoleonic cavalry. It explored his genuine belief in destiny, his conviction that he was born for war. It showed a man who didn't just tolerate combat. He craved it. War wasn't duty for Patton. It was fulfillment. These weren't the themes of a traditional war epic. Studio notes came back brutal, too philosophical, too strange. Audiences want action, not introspection. They wanted a heroic checklist: courage, sacrifice, victory. Coppola had delivered moral ambiguity, spiritual obsession, and uncomfortable questions about what kind of man thrives in violence. Fox executives made their decision. Coppola was removed from the project. Other writers were brought in to fix the script, to add spectacle, remove complexity, make Patton safer. But producer Frank McCarthy fought to preserve the core of Coppola's vision. He understood something the studio didn't. The strangeness was the point. The script, deemed too psychological, would eventually win the Academy Award for Best Screenplay. Coppola wasn't even in attendance to accept it. By then, he'd already moved on. Convinced his work had been rejected, with a script finally in place, the filmmakers faced their most critical challenge yet: finding someone willing to become George S. Patton. Every major star in Hollywood said no. Lee Marvin passed. Burt Lancaster declined. Robert Mitchum refused. Rod Steiger turned it down. The pattern was consistent, and the reasons were clear. Playing Patton wasn't just another role. It was career risk wrapped in controversy. Actors feared typecasting. One performance this intense could define them forever. Others worried about the moral implications. Portraying a man who slapped traumatized soldiers, who glorified war, who embodied everything complicated about military leadership. In an era of growing anti-war sentiment, playing Patton felt politically dangerous. Then George C. Scott read the script. He initially refused, but unlike the others, his hesitation wasn't about controversy. It was about compromise. Scott had one non-negotiable condition. The script could not be softened. No sanitizing. No excuses for Patton's behavior. No heroic redemption arc that didn't exist. He demanded the psychological complexity Coppola had written. The reincarnation beliefs. The obsession with glory. The moral contradictions. If the studio wanted a safe, comfortable war hero, Scott wanted nothing to do with it. The filmmakers agreed to his terms. It was a gamble that saved the project. Scott's intensity, his refusal to compromise, his total immersion into the character would transform the film from a historical drama into something almost uncomfortably real. Without Scott's willingness to embrace the darkness, Patton would have remained impossible to make. With a star finally committed, production faced an impossible obstacle. The Pentagon's refusal meant no American military equipment, no bases, no cooperation whatsoever. Making a World War II epic without the U.S. military seemed impossible. The filmmakers needed thousands of soldiers, authentic tanks, military aircraft, and vast landscapes that could double as North Africa and Europe. Hollywood mock-ups wouldn't suffice. The scale demanded real resources. Desperately, they searched for alternatives. An unexpected ally emerged: Spain. Generalissimo Francisco Franco's government offered something extraordinary: full military cooperation. Thousands of Spanish soldiers would portray American, British, and German troops. Spanish tanks would be modified to resemble Sherman and Panzer models. Spanish air bases would become staging grounds for massive battle sequences. The irony was staggering. A film about American military triumph in World War II, fought against fascism, was being made possible by a fascist regime the U.S. Army refused to support. Cold War politics created strange partnerships. The scale was massive. Over 10,000 Spanish troops participated. Entire military divisions were repurposed for filming. The Spanish government saw opportunity, international prestige, tourism revenue, and positive relations with Hollywood. But compromises were necessary. Certain historical details were altered to accommodate available equipment. Geographic liberties were taken. Spanish landscape stood in for Sicily, France, and Belgium. Yet somehow, the visual authenticity worked. Necessity forced creative solutions that gave the film its epic grandeur. What began as desperation became innovation. The sequences filmed in Spain remain some of the most visually stunning tank battles ever captured on screen. America rejected the project. Spain built it. Despite all the controversy, despite every battle to keep the film honest, there's something audiences never realized. The movie softened the real Patton. His belief in reincarnation wasn't poetic metaphor, it was genuine conviction. Patton seriously claimed to remember fighting as a Greek hoplite, a Roman legionnaire, a soldier under Napoleon. He described these past lives in specific, unsettling detail. He believed destiny had shaped him across centuries, specifically for World War II. His obsession with war went beyond professional duty. Patton didn't tolerate combat. He loved it. He found beauty in battle, fulfillment in violence, joy in the chaos that traumatized other men. His letters and diaries reveal a man who felt most alive when closest to death. And his language was far more profane than the film dared show. The opening speech, already considered shockingly aggressive, was actually restrained compared to Patton's actual addresses. His real vocabulary was so crude that even military audiences were sometimes stunned. The filmmakers deliberately toned down his profanity, knowing audiences would reject complete authenticity. Even his voice was wrong. The real Patton spoke in a surprisingly high-pitched tone, far from George C. Scott's commanding baritone. But filmmakers knew audiences wouldn't accept a squeaky-voiced general, regardless of historical accuracy. These compromises were necessary for the film to exist at all. Yet even after restraint, Patton remained controversial. Critics debated whether it glorified war. Veterans argued over its accuracy. The film walked a razor's edge, honest enough to feel real, softened enough to be watchable. The truth was always more extreme than cinema could handle. When filming began, something unsettling happened on set. George C. Scott didn't just play Patton, he became him. Crew members reported that Scott remained in character between takes, his intensity never breaking. He adopted Patton's posture, his mannerisms, his commanding presence. Some cast members admitted they felt genuine fear around him. The line between performance and possession blurred uncomfortably. Veterans who later watched the film said it felt like Patton had returned from the dead. But the film's most critical moment wasn't a battle scene. It was an act of cruelty. The slapping incident. When Scott's Patton strikes a terrified soldier suffering from battle fatigue, audiences recoiled. There was no justification offered, no redemption provided. The film forced viewers to confront an impossible truth. Great leaders can be deeply, disturbingly flawed. In 1970, this scene was controversial. Today, it's recognized as the film's moral anchor, the moment that gave Patton integrity by refusing to excuse the inexcusable. Then came the ultimate irony. The film swept the Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, total triumph. And George C. Scott refused his Oscar. He rejected Hollywood's highest honor, calling the competition a meat parade. The actor who embodied Patton's defiance enacted his own rebellion. The film no one wanted had conquered the industry, only to be rejected by its own star. It was pure Patton, victory paired with contempt for ceremony. All glory is fleeting, even acceptance. The filmmakers made one final crucial decision. They refused to show how Patton died. The real ending was anticlimactic and tragic. December 1945, a car accident in Germany. Paralysis. 12 days of slow decline. Death far from battle, in a hospital bed. The fate Patton himself had always dreaded. It was historically accurate, but thematically wrong. Instead, the film ends with Patton walking alone across an empty battlefield, his dog beside him. No explosions, no triumph, just silence and fading light. A voiceover reminds us that all glory is fleeting, that conquerors are eventually forgotten. It transformed history into myth, fact into meaning. And then, the greatest reversal of all occurred. The U.S. Army, the institution that had resisted the film for years, that feared it would glorify violence or embarrass the military, embraced Patton as essential viewing. It became required study at West Point and officer training programs worldwide. Not for tactics, for leadership. The film taught what manuals couldn't. That brilliance and cruelty can coexist, that effectiveness doesn't equal virtue, that leaders must be understood in full complexity, flaws included. The film they feared became the lesson they needed. Patton endures because it refused comfort. It didn't sanitize war or simplify leadership. It showed truth as messy, contradictory, and uncomfortable. The Army resisted honesty. Hollywood hesitated before complexity. But the filmmakers persisted. And in doing so, they created something rare, a war film that doesn't lie. If this story meant something to you, if it changed how you see leadership or history, or what it takes to tell the truth when everyone wants you to lie, then do me one favor. Subscribe. Because I'm not backed by a major network. I don't have a marketing team. The only reason these stories survive is because people like you decide they matter enough to support. Don't let the algorithm bury this. Make sure the next untold story reaches you. Subscribe now. All glory is fleeting, but truth lasts.